It seems that not everyone has joined yet, but I suggest we do kick off because otherwise we might be running out of time. So I'll just start with the introduction, which is not the most interesting anyway. Welcome everyone who has already joined to the report launch of Save the Children in Netherlands and the Center for Child Rights and Business. The report, the Dutch finance sector's role in improving child rights in the cobalt, artisanal and small-scale mining is published today. My name is Josje Beukema. I work as an advocacy advisor for Save the Children Netherlands, and I will be moderator today. Before we begin, I have some practical things to tell you. First of all, as you just heard the nice lady say, that this webinar is being recorded, so please be aware of that. The second thing is that we will have a Q&A session, as you can see on the program here, and we'll use the Q&A box. You will find that in the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A icon. Please put your questions in there and make sure that you mention who your question is directed to, so that when we come to the Q&A phase that we know who to ask what question. Next week, the biannual Global Conference on Child Labor is organized by the ILO. It will take place in South Africa, and governments from around the globe will gather to discuss how to push for the elimination of child labor. And in this light, we also want to draw attention to what companies, and particularly today, the financial sector, can do to contribute to that cause. The report we're going to hear from in a short while today is based on an initial report commissioned by our German colleagues at Save the Children and also executed by the center. Did a ground assessment actually into the state of the child rights in artisanal small-scale mines in the DRC, and what companies can do to improve children's rights and combat child labor. In this report, recommendations were made that are also relevant to investors. However, we want to get a closer look on exactly what could be improved in the role of investors to leverage these changes that are needed. During this webinar, we will hear from the researchers who will give us an overview of the study. Then we'll hear from our panelists, and maybe we can show the slide of who they are today. A warm welcome to them again. And then we want to give all the attendees the possibility of asking your questions. And the Q&A will actually be introduced by Hester Holtland from the Dutch VPDO. She will tell you who they are. And before I hand over to the researchers, I quickly want to test the knowledge of the attendees on the topic of child labor and cobalt. So we have a little Menti quiz, which you can see in your screen if you can grab your phone. And now the screen is gone. Grab your phone, go to menti.com, and the code is, I can't see the code anymore. And you can put in the code 32921843. So that's 32921843. I don't know if anyone, and then you will see the first question: how many children are actually involved in child labor globally? And we are basing these numbers on the latest estimates done by UNICEF from 2020, which is pre-COVID. So it might actually be worse than what we think, or we actually already know it's worse than what the latest estimates are. I see that not many people have responded to our question. The options are 120 million, 160 million, 200 or 250 million. They're all high numbers. guess there's some trouble in going into menti.com, or people are just tired of Menti, which is not completely it's a bit understandable, but I'm not gonna. So the answer is actually 160 million. I won't, otherwise we'll spend too much time on Menti, which would be a shame. Now I suddenly see. Okay, this is surprising. Actually, the majority said 200 million. Usually the answer of the guess of what people think is a lot less, and obviously this crowd is very much aware of the size of this problem. But 2 people were right. It's 160 million children. And then we have another question. What is the estimated rise in the demand for cobalt expected in 2030? Is the demand not expected to rise at all? Is it expected to double? Or is it going to be a 4-fold, 3, 4, or 4-fold demand? Let's see, the answers are coming in. And I think the majority of the attendees are again correct. A 3-fold demand, rise in demand, which is crazy. And you will hear a bit more about the context later, but it actually shows us that there is an urgency in addressing the problem of children's rights in the mines. As you can see, the rise for cobalt will only increase mostly due to electrification. But now I will hand over to the actual experts, and they will give you an overview of the study today. We'll also give you a link to the full study in the chat box as well. But please, Canaria, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jus. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. I'm Canaria from the Center of Child Rights and Business. And some of you might have attended the launch webinar that we did end of last year on the first Cobalt study we did with Save the Children. So that was actually a child rights assessment in the ASM Cobalt sector in DRC. And what came out as a clear recommendation from that previous study is the importance of companies to engage with Cobalt ASM, to push for formalization. And we realize that the financial institutions play a key role in moving this process forward and facilitating access to remedy. So we carried out the second study as an extension to the first study, where we specifically look at the role of the financial institutions in advancing the child rights in the Cobalt ASM sector. So while our first study gathered data on the ground to understand the impact of the Cobalt ASM on children's rights, and the second one is more of a high-level assessment that we did, that we relied on desktop research and in-depth interviews and a survey with financial institutions. You jumped a little forward. Okay, so demonstrate why Cobalt ASM is relevant to the Dutch finance sector. We looked at how the financial institutions are linked with the Cobalt ASM through their investing and lending activities. We examine what the human rights due diligence expectations from the finance sector mean for the Cobalt industry, and also showcased not only the best practices, but the gaps in identifying, monitoring, and addressing the human rights and child rights risks in the Cobalt ASM. And that said, our report by no means intends to score and compare the performances of individual companies, but to provide education for the financial institutions as a whole so they can better protect children's rights and strengthen remediation in the Cobalt ASM communities. Next slide, please. So financial institutions can be linked to Cobalt ASM through their lending or investing activities in various players in either the upstream part of the supply chain, such as LSM here, which is a big mining company, or downstream company that can be a commodity trading company, a battery manufacturer, or a consumer brands in ICT. So a little technical point to note here is that even if a company claims that their supply chain is free of ASM Cobalt, it's not very likely and less relevant, because For one, upstream part of the cobalt supply chain is less visible, and there are points where LSM cobalt and ASM cobalt can be mixed. And we say it's less relevant because ASM communities, which are usually close to the LSM sites, do not get the economic benefits from the mining enough to escape poverty, even though it's the livelihood of hundreds of thousands of families and children. Next slide, please. So here are a few examples of how Dutch financial institutions are linked with Cobalt ASM through their investing in or financing companies in the downstream part of the cobalt supply chains. As we can see, there are billions of dollars invested in some of the major technology and car companies that source cobalt from DRC by Dutch insurance companies, pension funds, asset managers, and commercial banks. And banks' lending activities are, of course, less visible to us due to the client confidentiality. Next slide, please. In terms of regulatory framework, there are various international standards, most notably the UNGPs, the OECD guidelines that call for financial institutions to carry out human rights due diligence. However, these standards are voluntary in nature and do not establish consequences for non-compliance or general legal obligations for companies. In the mineral supply chains, there are Dodd-Frank Section 1502, and then there's the EU's new conflict minerals regulations. But then again, cobalt is not a conflict mineral, so it's technically excluded from these regulations. That said, this regulatory gap has been narrowing with the EU and various European countries, including the Netherlands, issuing mandatory human rights due diligence laws in recent years, such as the European Union mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, and the most recent Dutch national corporate due diligence legislations, etc. Additionally, many companies have voluntarily begun to adopt cobalt into the responsible mineral programs, along with other conflict minerals. And also, some sources predict that cobalt is likely to be included in the EU's new conflict minerals regulation. So basically, the legal environment is increasingly holding companies accountable for human rights abuses, including child rights abuses. And what that means for the financial institutions is that they're not only expected to strengthen their own human rights due diligence systems, but are also strongly encouraged to support their clients and investee companies to better identify, address, and monitor human rights risks in their cobalt supply chains. Next slide, please. So in the report, we shared some best practice examples from financial institutions that excel in certain aspects to respect human rights in the cobalt sector, which help us draw recommendations for the financial institutions in general. However, financial institutions in general, including the Dutch finance sector, have some major gaps in their practices to identify and address human rights and child rights risks in the cobalt ASM. First of all, in identifying human rights and child rights risks, most investors rely on third-party ESG research and ratings, for example. A recent study by VBDO, maybe you read it, found that 93% of the institutional investors rely on exclusively data provided by external ESG research providers for the responsible investment policy. Of course, such approaches have their own clear advantages, but also come with some limitations. And here's just to list a few. On one, that they use reactive approaches, and oftentimes issues are flagged to investors once a serious allegation has been raised or a significant event has been occurred already. And two, these ESG research providers offer global coverage for many, many thousands of companies, so might miss the broader context or fail to link the issues on the ground. For example, the role of formalization in addressing the human rights risk in the cobalt ASM sector. And three, high-risk contacts such as ASM cobalt In such context, the rating can potentially be used as exclusion criterion to divest instead of engaging with the companies. And it's also usually hard to obtain accurate data in this context, especially when the data is so sensitive in nature. And of course, there's relative scoring against peers and the overall rating that can miss some of the key areas. And in terms of children's rights, they're often left out of the investors' ESG and sustainability strategies apart from a single focus on child labor. And many fail to realize that the risk of child labor relates to other child rights and human rights risks, such as education and living wages for parents. And there is also lack of understanding of on-the-ground impact. To highlight this point, I'm going to read a quote by Mr. Bruno Marde from Aegon Asset Management from our interview, and hope you don't mind me sharing this. And he said, what's missing is consistent, systematic monitoring of the situation on the ground. You might ask a company to share its supply chain policies, and these may be well-written policies, but at the end of the day, whilst policies are important, there's still the possibility of a controversy tomorrow, and we can't agree enough with this statement. And there's definitely limited visibility on the ground in the systematic monitoring of child labor and other child rights risks. And in terms of the lending activities of the banks, we believe that transparency on the companies and projects that the banks finance is important for allowing stronger human rights due diligence practices, including a better communication with the affected people and better reporting of steps taken to manage the impacts. And transparency and accountability is also one of the 6 principles of the Principles for Responsible Banking. However, that usually gets in the way, what usually gets in the way of client confidentiality, or in other words, reluctant to seek consent from clients to publish their information. And only a very small number of smaller ethical banks with focus on lending to support sustainable and socially beneficial activities publish a full list of their corporate customers, and big banks usually don't. What it makes is that it's hard to establish a connection between the banks and the human rights violations of their clients and monitor the effectiveness of their engagement with their clients to address such issues. Next slide, please. The biggest gap, however, when addressing the human rights, child rights issues in Cobalt supply chain is access to remedy. Access to effective remedy is, as we know, a core component of the UNGPs and OECD guidelines. And OECD states that investors should use their leverage to influence the entity causing the adverse impact, prevent and mitigate the impact. And the UNGPs also says, that the banks have a responsibility to establish or participate in effective operational level grievance mechanism for individuals and communities who may be adversely impacted. The Dutch banking agreement recommendations for the bank is to strengthen the focus on remedy. But in reality, there is much room for improvement on how financial institutions are performing to facilitate access to remedy. For example, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights assessed investors' implementation of the UNGPs for its 10th anniversary and found that investors rarely engage portfolio companies on the effectiveness of companies' grievance mechanism, and thus portfolio companies are rarely pressured by investors to provide remedy to people who have been harmed. And in the Fair Insurance Guide into 2020, it also found that there is no evidence of the top 9 insurers in Netherlands using their leverage to encourage companies to enable remediation of adverse impacts related to human rights issues. In the Bank Trank's latest report in 2021, it's also stated that even the best performers are typically failing to demonstrate their human rights reporting that they have played a role in remediating or addressing specific adverse human rights impacts. And in our study, although we found that some financial institutions are supporting the establishment of remedy frameworks, we did not identify any that require clients to provide remedy for human rights abuses in their cobalt supply chain specifically. So overall, we don't see a very strong evidence that Dutch investors are playing a meaningful role in supporting or the provision of effective remedy to the communities affected by the adverse impacts, either by providing effective remediation mechanism or by supporting or strengthening the remediation efforts by others working to address the issues. So with that, I hand it over to my colleague Mark to share what we recommend for Dutch financial institutions to strengthen their approach to address child rights and child labor and other related human rights risk in the Cobalt ASM and DRC. Thanks for listening.
Great, thanks so much, Canaria. So in terms of recommendations then, so through the initial work that we did with Save the Children Germany and this follow-up investor study with Save Netherlands, we've identified and highlighted the dire situation that children and families face in Cobalt ASM communities. But also, as Canary has just mentioned, we've also highlighted how and where the Dutch financial sector and other financial sectors, if you like, outside the Netherlands, are linked to Cobalt, either directly or indirectly. And the risks that we've highlighted, but also gaps in terms of the financial sector's approach to addressing negative impacts, as well as missed opportunities to advance action to address child labour and improve child rights. So really, in conclusion, if you like, we've identified 6 key areas where we think additional action or focus is needed from the investment community. Again, not just in the Netherlands, but also more globally too. So the first area really is all about focusing ESG engagement to drive improvements on the ground in Cobalt ASM communities. So firstly, that's obviously about thinking about where and how you're exposed through your investing and lending activities. And again, there's obviously the direct links that might stem from investment in mining or exposure through mining and extractives, through to any investment that has links through to a company that sources cobalt or uses cobalt in its products. Obvious examples being electronics or renewable companies, etc. And obviously, the more that the world transitions to a green technology future and more towards renewable energies, then cobalt currently is going to be a big part of that. So firstly, think about your exposure. But also there are more specific areas where you can really focus your ESG engagement strategies as part of this. And we found that even though 65% of Dutch investors engage on child labour issues, or say they do, very few have specific policies in place to directly address or engage on child labour. So it's often one issue amongst many others that are engaged on. Now, obviously, that's to some extent inevitable, but given the risks we've shared today, it's really important that investors are a lot more focused and nuanced in their ESG approaches, engagement approaches in particular. So what does that mean? What does that look like? It's really about focusing on what actions that your clients or your investee companies are taking to address risks on the ground in their value chains. So the kind of areas we would suggest you should be thinking about, or investors should be thinking about, is increasing or focus engagement to increase companies' knowledge on the presence of child labour and its contextual nature. So, what are your companies you're investing in doing to address root causes of child labour and other contextual factors that we've talked about today? But also thinking about your role around advocacy for improved regulation legislation on child labour and addressing risks in cobalt. One example being advocating for extending the scope of the EU's conflict mineral regulation to include cobalt, as currently it does not. But also asking your investee companies or clients if you've identified if they have identified the key root causes of child labour in Cobalt ASM, and what are they doing to address it? So, for example, how companies improving conditions and access to fair and transparent markets for artisanal small-scale mining, for example, or pushing for formalization. What are they doing to support local living wage initiatives in cobalt-affected communities, access to education, etc.? So really, the first thing to focus really is looking at a more sophisticated, more informed approach to ESG engagement. Next up, though, really is the push for a formalization of ASM. So again, as Canary's covered briefly in the reports go into detail on, formalization really is key to pushing better or enabling better oversight and the implementation of measures in cobalt mines in the DRC and ensuring that child rights are respected. So there's an obvious role here for investors and lenders to encourage investee companies and your clients to push for the formalization of ASM. And again, this is about work that can be achieved in part through engagement with companies or through other means as well. An example would be the Enterprise Générale du Cobalt has published its responsible sourcing standards, which are principles which will require stricter controls around cobalt artisanal small-scale mining in the DRC. And again, this is leading through to increased action from the government in the DRC as well to address child labour risks in cobalt ASM and push for better standards. So there's opportunities there to extend engagement, not just with your companies in your portfolio, to also look at how you can connect with other organisations working in the space. Another really important one we're going to expand on a lot more today, I think, in the panel is facilitating access to grievance and remedy. And there's a clear and urgent role for financial institutions to improve access to grievance and remedy and play a greater role in strengthening this. Now, there are some challenges we recognise, of course. Financial institutions often feel they might be ill-equipped to directly follow up with investigations or monitor allegations in their clients' portfolios, supply chains. Some financial institutions have sought to establish their own grievance mechanisms to address risks in cobalt and other areas as well, which they're connected to through their lending and investment. But what we have found when we've looked at this through the research is that these mechanisms often face challenges in their accessibility, as well as challenges related to remoteness. So obviously, as investors, or lenders, you're not always able to connect with issues further downstream in supply chains or in your clients' portfolios. So whilst these mechanisms have a role to play, they alone we think, are unlikely to close the remedy gap in a meaningful way. So instead, an area to focus on really is thinking about how financial institutions should broaden their focus to consider what role they can play in really enabling access to remedy to address child rights risks in cobalt. And organizations such as Shift and others have talked about an ecosystem approach whereby financial institutions use their leverage to really identify and support different options or platforms for remedy. What does that mean practically, though? It really is about being proactive and supporting preparedness for remedy before harm's actually taken place. So what that means is communicating your expectations to your investee companies or those you're lending to on engaging them on the effectiveness of their grievance mechanisms. So what mechanisms do they have in place? How are they implemented? How are they monitored? How can those companies in your portfolio share their insights with you so you have a better understanding of what the risks are? But also looking at how you can support existing grievance mechanisms and support those working on the ground to offer remedy as well, and looking at a role in that. Then just quickly on the last two, the other obvious one that comes up a lot is how to take collaborative action and participate in multi-stakeholder initiatives. So within the report, we talk about different programs and collective engagements that have supported, to some extent, action to address cobalt, child labour risks in cobalt. Obvious examples would be the Principles Response to Investment that's had collective engagements which have focused more on strengthening policies and practices. But there's a clearer role again for financial institutions to play a more active role in participating in multi-stakeholder initiatives and using your joint leverage. One example or opportunity there would be organisations such as the Fair Cobalt Alliance, who are bringing companies together and other stakeholders to strengthen conditions in the DRC, but also to look at how to strengthen access to remedy as well. So looking at options for collaborative action is key. And then really thinking about how you engage mining companies specifically on issues related to Cobalt ASM. So where you are investing in large-scale mining companies, making sure that you're engaging them on the issues that they need to be aware of. As we've identified through both studies, large-scale mines are directly linked to artisanal small-scale mining. Small-scale mining often happens on the edge of large-scale mines, but communities which are artisanal small-scale mining communities often don't get to benefit from the activities from large-scale mining. So it's really important to think about the issues we've shared today in engagement with large-scale mining as well, so that they play their role in addressing some of the risks we've identified. And then finally, it's really about thinking about strengthening monitoring of child labour risks related to Cobalt ASM. And the quote that Canaria read out, I think, nicely captures this. But really, what we've picked up through interviews with investors and through some of the desk analysis we've done as part of this study is that there's a real interest and need for investors and lenders to better connect with issues on the ground. So, how can you, have a more sophisticated understanding further down supply chains of where the risks are, in this case, in Cobalt ASM. And that really the opportunities here are for financial institutions to engage more and connect with NGOs or other organizations working the ground to address child rights in Cobalt ASM. So there's a broad range of stakeholders, of course, working in the space. Save the Children, the Centre, Fair Cobalt Alliance, and many others. So really the first thing is looking at either collectively or individually how to better engage with those organizations. And that's not just through grievance, but also looking at opportunities to support mechanisms to deliver remedy. So where organizations are delivering remediation, looking at how the financial community can support that. And that can be financial support, or other kind of leverage as well that you use. So that's just a roundup of some of the key recommendations. The report we would strongly suggest you look at, because we do obviously elaborate quite a lot more on the key issues that we've shared, but hopefully that serves just to give you a sense of the key areas we'd suggest require a greater focus.
Great, thank you so much, Canaria and Mark, for presenting the report. In the meantime, we have put a link to the report in the chat, so now fully available for everyone to read. But first we'll hear from the reflections of our panelists, who you see here today, who are with us. We'll actually start with hearing from Kees Gootjes, who works for ABN AMRO. And without further ado, I'd like to give him the floor. Go ahead, Kees.
Yes, good afternoon and good evening and good morning, whoever. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to be part of this, and also congratulations on an insightful report. It was interesting to read, and I'm happy to provide some comments on it. I do feel a little bit like I'm kind of preaching to the choir, especially when it comes to the topic of access to remedy, and that's something that was very much covered by both Canaria as well as Mark. But I do feel indeed that the financial sector, and that's something that I think you might have seen in a recent blog post that was published, that was authored by me on the BSR and also on the Business Human Rights Resource Center websites, on these sort of leading role the financial sector can play in providing access to remedy. And why do I, from my perspective at ABN AMRO Bank, why do I focus so much on access to remedy? Well, it's because in terms of being, let's say, causing, contributing, that whole continuum between directly linked, causing, contributing, ABN AMRO is a little bit further away because we have relatively recently taken steps to reduce our essentially exposure to commodity financing, and so that was something that has happened, a while back, and has sort of been taking place. So in terms of directly financing, for example, commodity traders, that does not happen anymore at ABN AMRO. But as the report and as Canaria also mentioned, given the ubiquitous nature of the use of cobalt throughout the global economy, throughout the renewable, throughout the automotive economy, throughout batteries, whatever, this is really a systemic issue. And it's an issue that then, of course, through our activities, through both our lending as well as our investment activities, has an impact on us as well. And that means there is a link, whether we like it or not. A bit of a background to myself: before joining ABN AMRO, about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, I also worked at an NGO in the garment sector, Fair Wear Foundation, and there I dealt with cases of child labor myself. And at another previous employer, I also did a project on the ground in DRC in an LSM, so not an ASM, but an LSM cobalt mine. So this topic is relatively, I'd say I'm at least a little bit familiar with this topic. So that's why it's also very it's of interest to me. But given, like I said, the systemic issue of the use of cobalt, and that it's coming in the majority of this cases from DRC, I think a systemic issue like that does need to be addressed by a systemic, I would say, a solution, or at least part of a systemic solution, a proactive systemic solution. That's why I really wanted to focus also my comments on access to remedy and the role that we as financial sector can play in facilitating it. Because I think, if we get access to remedy right, it can really help contribute to, positively impacting the issue of child labor in cobalt mines in DRC, but also in other regions and other fragile regions around the world, that can be, a significant part of the solution. And you've been talking about access to remedy and the uses of it, but I think for me, and that's what I kind of use in the financial sector when I describe what access to remedy is, I think it's very, very important to just keep it as simple as possible. Essentially, access to remedy is just an acknowledgement of the fact that despite government policies and regulations and maybe corporate policies or practices, or sometimes the lack thereof, things still go wrong. And access to remedy essentially means that those negatively impacted by economic activity have the ability to share their grievance and have it remediated in one way or the other. It's not that sort of complex of an issue to understand. How to work it out can be quite difficult, but just the concept of access to remedy, I think, is just really important to have, and that's kind of that sort of basic definition of that I try to use in the financial sector as well. Because what can we do as financial sector? Well, I really think we have a role in facilitating access to remedy in this sort of ecosystem. But what are some reasons, again, as the financial sector, what are some reasons for us to do this? And that's something I described in that recent blog post as well. It's really in our interest to facilitate access to remedy. In the first place, I think it's part of our responsibility. We make economic activity possible, and therefore we should be taking responsibility for the fact that some economic activity has a negative impact on people. At the same time, the costs of unaddressed social issues can have a significant impact on the economic or the financial performance of companies that we, lend to, that as financial sector we lend to, or as financial sector we invest in. But of course, there's of course reputational elements. But of course, there's also the upcoming legislation, for example, here in the EU with the corporate sustainability due diligence guidelines that talks about having a complaints procedure in place. So whether we like it or not, we have to do something with access to remedies coming towards us, and what do we want to do with that? And I think one of the solutions is raising awareness. I'm in the middle of having lots of discussions with people within the financial sector about access to remedy, what it is, but also what it's not. I mean, there's a quote I think of mine in the report that you just shared, that kind of states, what is not. And it's important to have awareness of what can we do as financial sector on access to remedy, and particularly how can we use our leverage, our different forms of leverage. Lending leverage is very different from investment leverage, from private equity leverage, from whatever, clearing activities. How can we use our different forms of leverage as financial sector to facilitate access to remedy? And that's something that I want to be exploring, in the future. And when it comes to, access to remedy within a DRC context, it is a reality that child labor does take place. So there has to be some sort of community-based, access to remedy mechanism there. And I think it will be up to us as financial sector using our different forms of leverage to make sure that those that those grievance mechanisms are actually working, are actually operational, and there's some effectiveness criteria for that. But I think I want to leave it at that, and leave it up to the next person to comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kees, for your very warm plea for the role of the financial sector in access to remedy. Just as a quick clarifying question, because when you spoke about at the end about like a community-based grievance mechanism, does that mean that you're thinking of a grievance mechanism that's actually broader than just for the people who are actually working in the mines, but are also available to the parents or the caretakers or the women who stay at home while their men go off to work?
Well, I mean, I see it in two ways. One, because ASM as it is, it's informal labor, so it's community based in the sense that it's not the grievance mechanisms that I come from the garment sector. You basically put up a poster in a factory and you say, call this number if there's issues. You cannot do that in an ASM mining context. So in that sense, it's community based. In other sense, indeed, the children themselves involved might not be able to be aware of this, given the fact that they're children. But indeed, their caretakers or other members of the community can make use of such a grievance mechanism to share this problem. And also, it's not just I would say in the DRC context, having a grievance mechanism for child labor, but of course, what are some of the root causes of child labor? Well, that's if as parents or as caregivers, you're not earning enough money, not being treated properly, so that in order to survive, you're sending your kids to the mine, or the kids are mining instead of going to school. So if you address some of the labor rights issues through a grievance mechanism, you can also impact the prevalence of child labor. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Kees. And now we'll hear from Laura Gerritsen, who works for the Fair Cobalt Alliance, one of the multi-stakeholder initiatives that we also mentioned in the reports. Laura, can I give you the floor?
Yes, thank you very much, Risha. And also, thank you very much for inviting me. And also congratulations with the report. I must concur a bit that a lot of good points were already really mentioned in the report, with a lot of very sound recommendations. So I think I might be slightly repetitive with some, but would like to just highlight some from my perspective. Just as a short background, the Impact Facility is an international NGO, or an NGO, and we are managing a key project which is called the Fair Cobalt Alliance, which, as you mentioned already, is a multi-stakeholder initiative, really combining and convening different supply chain actors along the cobalt supply chain, so from the mining sector to the end use sector, as well as different other nonprofits to look at improving mining communities at large. And there are also having a focus on child labor together with the partners of Safe in the Center. But that is a short introduction. I just want to maybe contribute also in a little bit of my perspective, also knowing indeed the sort of end user background to these issues as well. And what is interesting is it has been already mentioned that a lot of that we're now in the middle of a sort of green technology revolution. And you see that cobalt is estimated to, well, triple, but in 2015, even almost by 600%. So it's a lot of the energy transition items that we need are very much mineral based. So not only cobalt, but also lithium, nickel, copper, other materials that are used in wind turbines or other green transition technologies. So that the notion that we are actually moving from a fossil fuels to a mineral economy is quite important to keep in mind, because you see quite a strong move of companies, but also the financial sector, as was highlighted before, to move away from investing or trying to focus much more on recycling. However, the point I want to stress is that mining is going to be really crucial for quite years to come for companies as well as the financial sector, as they invest obviously a lot logically in those green technology companies as well. But that is important to realize, because you see an increased pressure, as also mentioned in the report, on companies to deal with the issues in that supply chain. And that presents them with often a very complex problem because they're multiple tiers away from the mining sector directly. And especially now with a high emphasis on a risk-based discourse. So looking at analyzing risks in supply chains, and as well being confronted sometimes with a lack of understanding of the local situation and lack of tools to actually start driving change on the ground. A lot of companies react with a more risk avoidance mentality, while actually that can be quite harmful for situations such as child labor, which is also featured in the report, that with the corona pandemic, you see these economic shocks even deprive parents that live from mining income much more, which actually negatively affects child labor, which is also the same same thing that happens if companies disengage. So in general, we're looking at shifting that paradigm more to, because items such as things such as child labor are not easy to solve. It's not a thing where you can put a fence around a mine site and then expect child labor to disappear, as it requires multiple interventions, as some colleagues on the call and on the panel can probably highlight much more. But you would basically just drive child labor towards another sector if there are no improved incomes of miners, if there's no oversight and formalization, then they will not have the means necessary to send their children to school or to pay for items. Or when there's no functioning educational system or no shelters for orphaned children, then you lack the infrastructure and the systems actually to solve it. So another point I wanted to stress that is you cannot expect that to change overnight, but you should look at improving that progressively, and that just needs investments and engagement of companies, as they are, of course, quite a heavily influencing factor also for the prices that can be paid locally, but also just basic money is needed to create those systems to actually reduce child labor effectively over time. In my view, actually, the financial sector, and I think that has been also highlighted in some instances, has a couple of ways that they could help reduce child labor and actively support improvements locally. And one of the items that has already been mentioned is to work with companies they invest in, to actually not only look at the policies, this was also already sometimes mentioned, but basically, so more rewarding involvement in engagement, and therefore sometimes accepting that some risks are still in that supply chain, but they can only be improved by investing by these companies over time. And therefore accepting also a progressive improvement approach, and looking at impact indicators rather than indeed the more high level policies or risks that are attached to investments in certain companies. And another item is that there can also be direct investments of financial institutions that can be grant-based to multi-stakeholder initiatives or local initiatives that actively work on these issues. But another item that maybe is a bit more controversial is that mining, large-scale mining, but also small-scale mining, is usually quite capital intensive. So those also need loans or equipment to actually be able to improve their own businesses, and thereby also improve on their own working conditions in the longer run. So improving the worker incomes, health and safety standards, managing child labor and contributing to that. So therefore, there might also be a role from the financial sector to look at smaller scale loans or investments to these sectors to actually be able to allow them to become more profitable. Because, as been said, lending leverage is also a leverage that financial institutions have. And when combined with incentives and other types of support to support these artisanal mining organizations to actually perform better and formalize, that can have a very powerful effect locally on the ground as well. So I'll stop there, quite short, but I hope I highlighted some items from a little bit of a different perspective. So yes, and looking forward to questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Laura, for your insights into the experiences you have with the Fair Cobalt Alliance. Please, a reminder that if you have a question, you can put them in the Q&A box, and we'll put them forward to the panelists later. But now I'll give the floor to Lauren Compere. She joined us all the way from the US, so it's actually still morning for her. Lauren, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to highlight, I think I play a slightly different role as a global investor. You know, I'm not necessarily based in the Dutch market, but I think what's really important to understand as a global investor, really sort of seeking positive momentum with our companies, and also using our own leverage through engagement to address these issues, is that we are in a different time. We are looking at escalated risk now with the green recovery, really focusing on mineral sourcing. And so I think it's actually really important to move the needle and the expectation for investors. You know, I think for someone like us, you know, we were part of some of the initiatives, the collaborative initiatives that the report highlights. I think we engaged 16 companies under the PRI over the course of a number of years. But we need to have collective action and collaborative engagement focused on addressing the root causes of child labor in cobalt supply chains to become much more mainstream. And so this can no longer be sort of a focus on a niche activity from a small group of investors. But given sort of the correlating increase in risk with increased cobalt sourcing in the renewable energy sector, this needs to be a core mainstream issue for investors, no matter how they invest. For us, we don't directly invest in mining companies, and so really our exposure was more indirect through electronics and auto and ICT companies. And I want to highlight a couple of things. I think, you know, we because we have been focused on conflict minerals and cobalt sourcing, actually going back more than a decade now. We intentionally participated in multi-stakeholder initiatives and conversations with the OECD, collective action looking at the root causes with a group of companies over time, and also understanding that our use of multiple resources had to inform our perspective and ask with companies. So for example, I think as investors, we couldn't just rely on the ESG research providers to really truly understand what was going on in terms of the on-the-ground impact. And so we deliberately participated in multi-stakeholder discussions like the OECD, brought in on-the-ground perspectives who were directly addressing child labor and issues in not only sort of the regular cobalt sourcing in the big mines, but also artisanal mining. And I want to sort of bring this home with sort of a practical example, but also to say that as investors, we need to step up and look at ecosystem level change. And so, for example, one of the key interventions that the report talks about is actually looking at the regulatory environment. And we were one of a number of investors who had supported mandatory human rights due diligence in the EU a number of years ago. We also supported alignment and standardization of the conflict minerals disclosure rules between the US and the EU. And we think it is important that cobalt now become part of the scope of the EU conflict minerals. And so having investors lend their voices to that is really important. So focusing on both sort of ecosystem multi-stakeholder initiatives to inform how you collaborate and how you engage with companies. So let me bring it home with one practical example. So actually, even pre-PRI initiative, we were already part of a group of investors in Asia engaging on cobalt. And so, you know, our history and our understanding, right, our understanding of the on-the-ground impacts and what were good interventions and what weren't, I think were informed by you know, by many years of looking at this issue. But what I realized, especially coming out of COVID, was that the on-the-ground monitoring mechanisms, which is a key area that investors should focus on with companies, no longer were working. What we realized was that the traditional auditing, monitoring models that typical companies like Microsoft were using were not, they didn't have access to them. They couldn't send anyone to do the on-the-ground monitoring. So that meant that during COVID and sort of post-COVID, many of these mechanisms that were doing the traceability and transparency of supply chains and understanding the on-the-ground impacts needed to change. And so that would be one thing. And that means that actually as investors, to truly understand what impacts are happening on the ground, what are the right monitoring mechanisms, what are the right on the ground interventions, this requires investors to really have almost like an ongoing or an ongoing kind of due diligence and engagement process with companies. And that is, I think, really important. And one of those key mechanisms that investors should be using is actually having conversations with on the ground advocates and those that are actually part of the interventions in terms of the on the ground addressing child labor. And one of the, so we ourselves through a dialogue actually had access to a group called PACT, who were addressing on the ground interventions with child labor with Microsoft. And you know, we got to really understand what worked and what didn't work, and you know, I think those insights into what worked in one region and then how they were trying to scale it in another region. These on-the-ground interventions are very intensive, very nuanced, can change on a dime. And in the case of the post-COVID conversation we had with an on-the-ground NGO was that, you know, because there wasn't ongoing monitoring and the inability to really access on the ground monitoring resulted in vast changes in child labor. And so there were increases in child labor. There were increases in very dangerous work. And so this means that as investors, you really need to ask companies about what are they doing to conduct ongoing monitoring, ongoing interventions, how their approaches are changing. And this is not something you can talk to a company in 1 year and expect that 3 years later the same circumstances are in place. I think I'll stop there, but I do think as many of the recommendations in the report support, you need to have access to on-the-ground NGOs to really inform how you're going to engage with companies and what you're going to ask them on. And absolutely, some of those core things are access to remedy, access to grievance mechanisms, and frankly, participation in collective action to address root causes. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It sounds like you have so much more to tell us actually from the experiences you have, but I think due to time we do have to move on to the next speaker, and we'll come back to you during the Q&A. Our last speaker is Ines Kaempfer. She is the CEO of the Center for Child Rights and Business. And Ines, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for all the good thoughts shared so far. And I really hope I can add some more good thoughts because so much has been covered already. I did also want to really take up this question on access to remedy, and we've talked quite a bit about that. And as I think Kees said, it's actually quite straightforward, but it's still a really, in our experience, working very practically with, in particularly access to remedy for children found in child labor. we see that it is big challenge. I think it's access to remedy has turned out to be really one of the big challenges of kind of human rights due diligence generally, but I think particularly for in the area of child rights, it is probably even more challenging. So for one, often child labor cases or other violations of child rights are not necessarily reported through kind of even functioning grievance mechanism. They're also not very easily found, for example, through very good worker voice channels. And often audits or monitoring also seems to fail to actually detect child labor. And I think obviously very much linked to that is the kind of intrinsic informality that child labor is found under. Children in work are either kind of the part of the undocumented workforce in formal businesses. So we have seen, for example, factories that hire formal workers and everything is fine, but then they have these daily laborers who come in, and that's where a lot of children are part of those daily laborers. And so there's no tracking, no records, etc. And so they go under the radar. And as obviously as we have the situation in DRC, it's the children are not in the LSM, they're in the ASM, which is part of that bigger Cobalt kind of like ecosystem, but the children are very less likely to see them. Also, victims of child labor and other child rights violations are often really kind of the most vulnerable and have very little agency about their fate. If they're found in remediation, often they're not asked what should happen with them. We've even seen kind of spectacular kind of news or saving children out of child labor are being made out of that, often for kind of like the benefit of local politicians, or I'm not talking specifically about DRC right now, but more about general what we have observed. And what obviously should happen is something what you can see on the slide, on the picture that I asked to show up there. Children during a focus group discussion in the Kolwezi mining community are asked about their perspectives, their needs, and sharing this kind of in interactive activities, and really are encouraged to create a voice. And related to that, though, we see that there's very few people that do have in these settings that do have kind of the sufficient training and are professional in dealing with children, have sufficient knowledge around how to engage children, how to ensure child protection is available. And all of this makes that access to remedy, I think from a child rights perspective, even more difficult than it is already, I would say, with adults and in all situations. But as I think Kees has so rightly pointed out, it is really, we do think in allowing that access to remedy is an incredible gap. Well, it's an incredible gap, but also in that sense, a real opportunity. And the consultancy shift has called it the ecosystem of remedy enablers. And I really like this idea because I think the way I understand it, and I hope I'm not misinterpreting it, but the way I understand it is really to create this ecosystem of people who ask themselves the question, what can I contribute to remedy? How can I make this access to remedy possible? And not spend a lot of resources, time, and discussions on, am I really responsible? Is it really my business to be involved in this? But much more think about, well, we are operating in that area, for example. So we do have some business investments or whatever in Cobalt. Clearly, Cobalt brings the risk because it's happening in an environment of extreme poverty and a lot of other social issues that are around it. And I think also, as Kees said, there will be violations of human rights. There will be violations of child rights, even if we try to have preventative systems in place. These are, even if the government is improving their systems, etc., these are doomed to happen. So we need to be ready to happen. And so the question should be for all people in there, what is our role, what we can do? And from the financial sector perspective, we really see, a player that could become a very positive kind of force in creating that ecosystem. And maybe just as a last thought, because at the end of the day, it's not that complicated. It sometimes feels like it's really hard, but there's really access to remedy in our experience needs mainly two things. It needs that we have the right CSOs, NGOs, etc., on the ground that both can report violations, particularly for child labor. It's really important that violations are being reported through a system of grassroots organizations who are acting and supporting children and working in the interest of children. So we need to have those organizations on the ground to report it, and they need to have the right resources in place to act upon it and to become enabler of remedy. And for this last one, what we need to have is training and capacity building. The picture that you see here is a capacity building for local grassroots NGO in Cobalt on child protection. And right now, for example, this same grassroots NGO is going through a training of building their financial capacity, because we realize they don't have a financial system to, for example, help to distribute the funds or the remedy funds, so they can't track it. So we need to get them involved. And so I think that is just a very practical kind of example on how we can work on creating that capacity. And then the second part on top of creating the capacity is to have access to funds. And again, that seems so logical, but is often forgotten, because obviously we need to be able to have funds that, for example, allow children to go to school, that allow children to still be able to survive and, you know, get proper food, etc. So we need to have funds available. And we really hope that kind of these two pillars are pillars that we can strengthen, particularly in DRC there, and like getting to know, this is a relatively new area for me personally. I've worked mainly in Asia. I'm calling in from Hong Kong as well tonight. But seeing the needs, the extreme needs the children in these areas and these communities are in, the access to funding will be very, very crucial. And we can do a lot of capacity building of those groups and show them how to manage funds. If there are no funds, that will not help them. So I think we've just two things in mind, or like strengthening CSOs, ensuring they have the right capacity, but also ensuring that they have access to funds to actually distribute remedy and make sure that people caught in human and child rights violations have access to it, seems to be really a way. And if the financial sector can become a positive contributor, then he will, or that sector can really become a enabler of that ecosystem of remedy. So that's just a few, hopefully, quick thoughts. I don't know how I missed it.
Thank you so much, Ines. Thank you so much. I'm gonna do a little diversion from the program, because actually I had invited someone who is of a younger generation than us, and as we are child rights organizations, we did find it important to include the voice of the youth. And so I asked Nikki Tripp, she's here with us today. She's founder of the Shareholders of the Future, to ask the first question. So we're not going to first listen to Hester, but first, because she has to leave, I'll give the floor quickly to Nikki, because she has a question for our financials who are present. Please take the floor, Nikki.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Nikki Tripp. I'm 25 years old, and in my work I focus on youth representation and participation. So first, as a young person with so much more privilege than the children we talk about today, it is once so clear to me that where you were born can make such a difference in your life. And I would like everyone who works at an institutional investor or invest themselves, think for a moment about the children that we're talking about today, as that perspective sometimes gets forgotten. And even with access to remedy, their lives will for always be changed by an industry that we in the global West support and are exploiting. I was also asked to come up with a question. And in Ines' work, for example, it's pretty clear that the children in a local community are the center of everything, which is great to see. But for the financial institutions, this may be not the case. So Kees and Lauren, I was wondering, as an institutional investor, even though you may not have huge direct exposure, you're still investing indirectly and are part of the financial sector. How do you take these children serious? Can you make them and their human rights more important than economic gains, especially as their lives and quality of life are currently weighed against financial gains by the economy right now?
No, that's a great question. And actually, I think through our dialogue with some companies, I think first it's getting us to admit that, through our support and investing in companies, we have a responsibility to use our leverage, right, to create access to remedy. And frankly, it's to say to the companies, don't deny that there's child labor, right, in your supply chain. So that acknowledgement that there is child labor, and that really the most crucial intervention that a company can make is on the ground remedy and on the ground intervention. And so that's actually what we focused on through our corporate dialogue with one particular company. I've been to places like this. So I think also in some cases visiting and really understanding what's happening on the ground in some of these environments and the impact on children is really illuminating, and I think should be something that more investors.
And
Kees, do you also want to answer?
Yeah, sure. Lauren, were you finished? Because you kind of cut off halfway. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, and thank you for the question, Nikki. And it's a challenge what you say. I think I can give you very technical definition and technical sort of responses about universal ownership and about how difficult it is, what kind of priorities we have. But I think what it comes down to is, well, for example, here I'm in my ABN AMRO office currently. This is not a fake background. This is a real plant. But I'm on the 24th floor, and I look out over Amsterdam, and you kind of, as financial sector, you get this feeling. I think the Lloyd Bankfine from the former CEO from Goldman Sachs said it once. We're doing the work of God. You sometimes get the feeling as financial sector, we're not playing, but we're investing lots of money, we're lending money. Kind of get this feeling of, hey, we're in control, and you're not. And it's this realization. Before working at ABN AMRO, I spent 10 years in various NGOs. It's this realization that what we do here, the decisions we make on every single one of these floors here in this building, has an impact on people. Maybe somebody in the neighborhood over here behind me, or maybe what's going on in DRC. It has an impact. The money that we lend, the money that we invest, has an impact on people, and therefore we need to be aware of that impact. And the way, I have a business background myself, the way I was taught in my business school, I had one lecture on business ethics and human rights in 4.5 years of bachelor education. So my generation, I just turned 40, I got 3 kids myself. My generation has been taught to sort of do business in a way that helps my career as much as possible. And there's less of a focus on what we do with our money and the impact it has on people. So raising awareness that yes, there is a material impact about, from what we do. And, I think for me, I always kind of say, like, don't accept the status quo. What we do can always be improved. It's a different perspective that I'm now sitting at, a year at a bank. But you sometimes need to have a bit of an NGO mentality internally as well. And that's something I try to do, but keep asking those questions, because that's what we need to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, I will definitely keep on asking those questions and advocate for young people, as hopefully you will do more and more through your work as well. And thank you, Save the Children, for this beautiful report. I think it's very important for the financial sector, and we will share it as well with the shareholders of the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I know you have to go, so please feel free. Thank you for your contribution to the Q&A. We were supposed to hear from Hester, who has also worked on the issue of child labor in the financial sector. Hester Holtland, she works for VBDO, which is the Association of Responsible Investors. Unfortunately, she's having internet problems because she was going to kick off the Q&A with a little introduction into the work they have done in collaboration with the Work No Child's Business Alliance, which is a collaboration of Save the Children, UNICEF, and the Stop Child Labor Coalition, who run a program to eliminate child labor in 6 countries. Unfortunately, she's having internet problems. So I hope she'll be able to come back to us. But in the meantime, let's start with the Q&A. I was actually wondering if the panelists, if they have questions for each other, because I can also obviously ask you a question, and I'll be very happy to do so. But maybe you want to know a bit more about each other's reflections before I put my questions to you.
I'd love to ask a question.
Go ahead, Lauren.
For the panelists. I think for many investors, this issue is overwhelming, and they don't necessarily feel the direct connection. So either for the other panelists or for Save the Children report writers, how can what would be the 1, 2, 3 that investors should do? How does an investor begin to understand what their role could potentially be to alleviate and eliminate child labor?
I don't know, maybe Mark or Canaria or Ines want to take this question. Or Laura, because I see you're unmuting yourself.
Do you want to go first, or Laura? I'm sorry.
Ines, go first, and then Laura can come after.
I thought Mark was in the process of unmuting himself. Okay, I thought so. You looked like you were one. Okay. Well, I wish I had this really good, but I think really good answer. I mean, I think first of all, as you say, it is important to have some understanding of potential impacts, and we obviously encourage investors to really, when they, particularly if it's an investment, but even if it's lending, to understand, where's my money go to, and not only directly, but what are the indirect kind of consequences going to be. So, for example, understanding if I support a mine somewhere, there might be these artisanal mines popping up around it, and what is that going to be for the local community? What's that going to mean? So asking those questions is definitely a really good starting point. But then I think very quickly it should go, because sometimes we see that there's a lot of money and time and investment on that question, and then we have these huge reports, and these are your 500 risks that you get into, but then there's no more money to actually do anything about it. So I think very quickly then the second step should be understanding what are the resources that can potentially tackle some of those risks, and how can we support those resources. So, for example, is there a civil society that is looking into those issues and could support both preventative as well as a remediative action? If there isn't, what does it need? Where is the government? Obviously, in what is the process? Is that something we can rely on, or is it relatively weak? So we need to either need to support its kind of building of those structures, or also support kind of other structures. So I think very quickly asking the question, what is there and how can we practically support? And that's definitely an area where we find, like, also it's important. I mean, often, you will have all those meetings then, and everybody says, oh, it needs to be multi-stakeholder, everybody needs to be considered, and everything, and it needs to be systemic, and we want to make sure it's sustainable, and we have all those big words, and then at the end nothing is doing anything, because maybe at the beginning and the first day your intervention is not going to be comprehensive, multi-stakeholder, sustainable for the next 30 years. But in our experience, where we've seen, when people start to address questions, okay, I can't do anything, but everything, but we can start with that. And for example, we can start building a group of CSOs who at least will report back to us on what's going on, who will be our eyes and ears on the grounds. I think in other kind of sectors, community facilitators have been a very, very strong tool of communicating with companies and letting them know what's going on. We've seen that in COVID, for example, where kind of the normal channels broke down because there was no more monitoring, people didn't travel anymore. But those companies who were relying on community facilitators had ongoing information on what's going on in their supply chains, for example. Whereas those who didn't, or were just relying on auditing or monitoring, etc., didn't have that access. So I think that's probably in step 3, is like, see what's there and where can we start. And even if it's not from the get-go, this big, sustainable, all life-changing solution, to start small and then build on that. Because in my experience, that has just been so much more impactful than just, getting and I think, for example, the FCA is really trying that, and maybe Laura, you want to go into that, but it is an industry initiative. It tries to do that sustainable part and bringing different stakeholders together, but at the same time starting very small with very practical projects that you could even potentially, criticize and say, oh, that's just a small thing, but I think what I do like about it is that it doesn't just stop by talking, but it tries to identify those kind of starting points where we actually can get going. So I don't know if that was an answer.
If I just to really quickly add and maybe reinforce a bit, I think one thing that's clear again from the report is that the investment community is still spending a lot of time focused on risk identification. Of course, it's going to do that, but I think there's enough evidence to clarify that in the case of Cobalt, ASM in the DRC, child labour exists, and I think if investors and the financial institutions that we've been discussing could spend more time on remediation and less time trying to kind of prove the case on the need for it, both in terms of their focus, but also their investee companies' focus. I think that's a really important point. And I think, Lauren, it's a point that you made as well, that child labour is there. The question is, what do we do about it? How do we address it? But I think sometimes the focus still seems to be on identification of the risk rather than actually how we focus on addressing it as well. I think the other thing as well we looked at in the report really quickly is the role of ESG rating agencies and research organizations and how they look and monitor and manage risks and what kind of sources they use to really understand the nuanced issues around child labour risks. And we do find gaps in their approach, and the need for ESG rating agencies to look beyond company corporate reporting, look beyond policies and management systems approaches, and make sure that rating agencies really do a better job at tapping into insights from local organizations working on the ground, so that, just as we've been suggesting investors should, also ESG research houses, I think, have a role to play in getting nearer to the risks, looking at what's happening around remedy as well. So they're just two additional thoughts. Maybe
one final thought from me, because I think Ines and Mark already covered most of it, but I want to underline indeed that the ESG rating agencies that you just mentioned, Mark, are indeed quite crucial, because you can really measure a top level of policies and etc. Or for example, what companies sometimes start using now is eco-rating, where you get points for recycling, but if you're engaged with mining, that's actually a downside of it. So you get actually disincentivized a lot as downstream companies to actually engage with mining. Well, exactly, that is something that you could reward, so that they also start investing in that instead of avoiding it. And I think that's a key thing that has been overlooked, because recycling is just playing such a dominant role in our current kind of sustainability discourse, and that is something that the social indicators of what impact companies have, and really looking beyond the policy level at more certain key impact indicators, that is really crucial to drive the wider sector towards involvement and a longer term change.
Thank you all for your answers. Lauren, has it answered your question?
Yes, more than answered. Thank you.
And I have an immediate follow-up question, because actually this issue about the gaps with the ESG data providers, I know, Lauren, you also have experience with that, and that the Boston Common actually opts for doing a lot of the research yourself. Can you maybe elaborate a bit on why you made that choice?
Because the current ESG rating providers on this kind of issue are not really fit for purpose. I mean, as many of the other panelists highlighted, they focus more on process and corporate disclosure. I'm not quite sure. I think it's an interesting suggestion to think about how ESG rating providers can link to more on the ground or civil society. I feel like there could be a much more nuanced approach to controversies monitoring, for example. And so that could be a way for us to gain better insights. But as we well know, they don't necessarily focus on the remedy piece.
I guess just to respond to that, I think part of the issue as well is the reactive nature of the way ESG rating agencies, track issues. So often, issues will only be picked up, particularly through controversy-led approaches, obviously, once the issue's already occurred. So it's very much a kind of reactive response. I guess our challenge to the ESG rating industry is, research industry, is how do you be more proactive? So how can you get ahead of issues? And also how do you look beyond the risks towards remediation as well? But yeah.
Thank you so much. Actually, I'm looking also at the clock. We're almost running out of time. Hester hasn't been able to come back to us. She put her question to me in my WhatsApp. So I'm gonna to close off, I'm gonna ask Hester's question to the panelists, because she actually is wondering, how do you make grievance mechanisms or access to remedy effective? Like, what needs to be in place for it to be accessible and also to meet its goals? I don't know if maybe Lauren can go first, because you have some experience in that. How do you know if the mechanism that is in place is actually meeting its goal? I think also Lauren has some internet issues, as I think she's frozen, but maybe Kees, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure.
Answer this question?
Yeah, I can give a start. I mean, I can give you two things. I can give you the academic sort of theoretical version of effectiveness criteria, as Shift has developed, with I think in the context of the Equator principles has worked on effectiveness criteria. I think there are 9 different criteria when it comes to access to remedy, when it comes to grievance mechanisms, and you can kind of take an existing grievance mechanism and kind of essentially score it. But again, in my experience working with access to remedy, working on actual complaints, it's essentially using the right kind of leverage. An example I have for a female garment worker in Bangladesh who was missing, who had not yet received the second part of her maternity leave payment. She had been talking weeks and months, during her pregnancy with her employer about the fact that she needs to get that second payment, and it never happened. This, through in this case, the Fairwear Foundation grievance mechanism, got to me as case manager for that particular brand, and it took me like literally 1 hour of looking into it, making a phone call, and within half a day that was paid. So it's finding the right leverage, and that's something, again, we as financial sector have an opportunity. And that's something I want to explore, in terms of what kind of role the financial sector can play in access to remedy, is what kind of leverage can we use to make existing grievance mechanisms effective? Because I think, those complaints, those grievances are there, but are they reaching the right ears? And I think that's often just not happening. And I think that's something we can, as financial sector, play a role in. And got all kinds of ideas about that, but I'll let somebody else answer as well. Hopefully, Lauren can respond as well.
Yeah, Lauren, I think you were having some connectivity issues before. I don't know if you heard the question. The question was how to make sure that the grievance mechanism is actually effective and meets its goals.
I think you wanted Laura, right, from the Fair Cobalt Alliance, right?
No, it was also for you. Yeah.
Or was it? Actually, I on the question of, I wanted to highlight one other issue that might be important, and that is, at the end of the day, we need to see formalization of the ASM sector, right? Because when things are formalized and move from informal to formal, then it's much easier to have access to remedy and formalized grievance mechanisms.
I'm looking at the time. We're actually already 1 minute overdue. Actually, Lauren, thank you so much for that. Both you and Kees, as well for answering that question. I don't know if the other speakers still want also to give some input on this. I'll give you a second, otherwise I think we need to close. Thank you so much to all attendees and also the speakers, especially. I think we've actually discussed some very, very essential issues, access to remedy, but also like the monitoring challenges and collaboration also between, on the ground CSOs to make sure that, we meet each other and the information that is actually there that also reaches the financial institutions. And I think I can say for myself that I found it a very inspirational discussion. Unfortunately, time flies always. I hope that attendees also found the discussion interesting, but we have recorded it. So for those who can attend, we'll put it online most likely tomorrow. So anyone can rewatch it if they so please. Thanks a lot again to the panelists and to our guests, and I wish you a very good day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.